Vanna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I was actually laying in bed last night, and you know how your mind starts to race when you're
Yes.
trying to wind down. And
Yes.
I was
Perfect
thinking,
time, of course.
I know it's just, it's always such a blessing. But it really was because I thought, you know what? I cannot wait to talk to Anna tomorrow because,
Mm,
I had you as a guest on my podcast, and there's just these relationships when you've never even met before, but then you
mm.
start to speak, and it's just like this easy thing that happens. So thank you for that, and thank you for this space that makes people feel comfortable to share their stories. And genuinely, I'm honored to be here.
Oh, thank you. That was so sweet of you. I was on Vanna's podcast, by the way. Let's give that a shout out. It's the Mom Guilt podcast. She's a fantastic interviewer. So you definitely want to go check out Mom Guilt podcast. And yeah, it was an honor to be on yours. But it was during that conversation, we connected on so many levels.
Mhm.
So for those of you that don't know, Vanna is actually a skincare expert, over a decade of dermatological experience. She's a nurse practitioner. She is going to be on the podcast again. She's coming into our early morning habit community as a live guest expert, and then that will end up being posted to the podcast. We're going to talk all about skincare, which I'm so excited to dive into that. But when I was on her podcast, it came out that she is what she termed half adopted. She heard about the adoption program and the element to that, as the early morning habit is creating this adoption advocacy through our fundraising program. And she was sharing her story. And I was like, oh my word, would you be willing to talk about your story on the podcast? Because it's so insightful and no one's talking about it. It's really hard to talk about it. And I'm so grateful for you. So let's press rewind and just, kind of start at the beginning and tell us a little bit about your adoptee experience.
Mhm. Um, so I grew up in a small town in Alabama, if you can't tell with my accent.
She makes it
And
sound so beautiful, though.
I appreciate that because I do get self-conscious of it sometimes. But I grew up, and I am half adopted, as I like to say, by my father. And I've never met my biological father to this day. And it's a unique story because I actually have met my biological grandparents, also spoken to my biological aunt, his sister. So I think that it's really important to say that I knew that I wasn't being chosen by him. And it really was never talked about in our home. And I think that comes with, because it's a unique story for my mother, and that's not for me to share. But anytime I would ask, and I think honestly, the first time I ever got enough courage to ask my mom about it, I was in college because it
Mm.
just was not talked about. I knew I was adopted. I remember going to the courthouse. I remember changing my name, and I remember my parents saying that I was going to be adopted, but it wasn't a safe space to talk about emotionally, if that makes
How
sense.
old were you at the time?
I think I was 7.
Okay. Hmm.
So I have vague memories. And what's so unique also is that I've never spoken to my biological father, but I do remember speaking on the phone with my grandparents who lived in Hawaii. And for some reason, he wouldn't sign his rights over. This is the only part of the adoption that I remember, that he wouldn't sign the rights over. And they were asking, is this really what you want? And in my head, I was thinking, what do you mean, is this what I want? This man has been my father since I was 1 to 2 years old. I don't know any differently. And my biological father clearly wants nothing to do with me. So, of course, this is what I want. But it was very confusing in this very tug of war. And I think a lot of that would have been alleviated if it would have just been talked about in how does this make you feel? Because like
Mm.
off air we were talking about, there's a time to grieve that and a time to process
Mhm.
those emotions.
Mm. Mm. And so you said you were 7 at the time, and the man who was legally changing your name to his last name was the only father you had ever known up to
Mhm.
that point. Um, and then as you got older, tell me a little bit about any thoughts that went through your mind, or did you have any struggles with this idea that you were adopted? That like tell me some of the progression of your thoughts and emotions around being adopted.
I really think a lot of them were unconscious, and it does play a role that I was born in Hawaii. I actually did a genetic testing, and I am 46% of Chinese descent. So as you can
Interesting.
tell, I have an ethnicity to me. So it was something that when I
Is there any
always looked in,
Polynesian?
yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So you know our son's Polynesian. That's who we're adopting.
No,
It'll be from the
I didn't.
Pacific island of Samoa. So he'll be Polynesian. Yes.
So I always identified as Pacific Islander, and I always put
Okay.
that on all of my forms, and that is kind of what I identify with. And then I know that there's a lot more nuance to that, but when I did the genetic testing, it said 46% Chinese, and then there is Polynesian, Samoa, all that in there.
Yeah.
And all of that to say, I have an ethnicity, and you can tell that when you look at me. I can tell that when I look in the mirror. So I knew that I didn't look anything like my mother. If you've ever seen my mother, she has
Hmm.
blonde, curly hair, very light
Okay.
eyes. And then my father, he does have like a dirty, uh, light brown, blonde, reddish hair and dark
Yeah.
eyes, but you can tell I don't look anything like either one of my parents.
Yes.
So there's this unconscious reminder that I don't belong. And that is farther from the truth. That is a complete lie, but it's something that was always brought up and I was always asked about. They were like, "You don't really look like your parents." And then it would go into the story of, "Well, I don't know my biological father." So there was always this reminder, but again, never talked about. So I think I just
Hmm.
compartmentalized it and to the point where I couldn't anymore. Because as I became older, there was these things that would surface of not being good enough, not
Hmm.
having like the self-worth. And I think it's because I didn't deal with all of that growing up and it was never talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, the subconscious feeling of I don't belong is something I would love to touch on for a second because it's such an interesting reality that I love the fact that you said it's subconscious because
Mhm.
it's true. I think especially as a kid, I think there's a lot more awareness on racial diversity, which is a good thing, like acknowledging that somebody looks different because it's not a bad thing. It's just a fact. Like they look different and embracing that, which is beautiful. But even like our age, that was not as much the case, a decade ago or so when we were growing up, or 2 decades. Um, and there is that sense of what you see around you, and if it's not matching what you see in the mirror, that is like a subconscious, "Oh, maybe I don't quite belong." Just like I would feel if I was, being raised in an African village. I can
Mhm.
certainly understand how that would start to feel like that subconscious message of, "I don't belong," especially if it's not being acknowledged. I was in church the other day, it was the cutest thing. There was these 2 little, one little girl was 3 and the one little girl was 4, and they were both very, very dark brown skin. And the little 3-year-old stopped in the hall and saw the little 4-year-old, and she held out her hand, she said, "We match." And it just was
Oh
like
my
the
gosh.
sweetest, like, so simple, just this concept, but it's a predominantly, like, majority white church, and this little girl just saw another little girl, and it was just like this simple observation that we match, and I don't know why, it just melted my heart. It's this idea that it needs to be acknowledged,
Mhm.
and, that subconscious feeling of I don't belong, when it's not being acknowledged, that narrative then isn't being addressed. So,
Mhm.
I'm curious to hear, like, hindsight vision, obviously, in reverse, what do you think would have been helpful for you growing up to help interrupt that narrative in your mind of "I don't belong"? Knowing that it wasn't true, but still, that narrative is existing.
Mhm. And I think it's important to say that I went to a private school. It
Mm,
was predominantly white. There was barely any ethnicity within it. That's probably changed by now. I graduated in a class of 42, so I
mm,
was very different. And there were times when friends, and now they have called, they have texted and said, "I am so sorry if anything I ever said was of a racial slur."
Mm.
to you. And in my heart of hearts, these people, I love them, they love me, and I know that. But again, it wasn't talked about and acknowledged to be, hey, like maybe that's not appropriate.
Yeah.
But then again, it like I said, it wasn't talked about. So what I think first and foremost is for you to just ask. And maybe if your kids aren't willing to talk about it and they're not being super open, just keep asking, because I that was another thing, and I think it's a generational thing, that things were just swept under the rug in general when I was growing up.
Mhm.
And I'm thankful that's changing, and we are actually talking about that too. But in just saying, this is where you come from. Like, how do you feel about that? And just
Mm.
leaving it open to even talk about it, because if it's not brought up, think about it, someone that's younger, in their 10, 12, and into their teens, if you're not asking them and directing those questions, they don't even know how to voice that. And I didn't either, in saying it was a
Yeah.
subconscious thing. And even to recognize, like, hey, I've heard other people's stories and they said it made them feel this way. Do you feel that way? Because they may not
Mm.
know or understand what they actually are feeling. I didn't,
Mhm.
certainly.
Mhm. And you're saying specifically asking them about how they feel being a different ethnicity than what they might be seeing around them. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yes.
simply that, or even the adoption piece of feeling rejected. And
Mm.
and
Mm.
and now I see it, and it's so beautiful to really think about. And I did faith-based counseling a couple of years
Mm.
ago, and it didn't dawn on me that it was actually protection and redirection, not not rejection whatsoever. But I didn't realize that until I really thought about my circumstance and the fact that only such a good heavenly father would set me up to have an earthly father who is an amazing father to me. I couldn't have asked better of him. That it's kind of the picture of Jesus, right?
Mm.
He didn't have to,
Amen.
but he did.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a
Yeah.
lot of people can't fathom that, and they can't grasp that. But thankfully I can, because that happened to me in real life.
Mm. It's so beautiful. Whew. Yep. Yep. That'll make you cry. Um, but I mean, I cry on the podcast all the time. So what's new? People are so used to hearing me cry
I
on
would
here.
not be
Um,
surprised if I do cry today too. So we'll
Girl,
be even.
I mean, listen, you and me both. Um, what you talked about though, like this is the piece that I think really resonates with me, even as well, speaking of crying, it's gonna happen really quickly. Like I grieve the fact that my son has to be adopted. Like that kills me. Like I grieve adoption. I
Mm-hmm.
grieve the fact that he has had to go for 6+ years of his life having
Mm-hmm.
never heard a mother say, I love you in
Mm-hmm.
return. We just had a FaceTime with him the other day and he said, I love you in English. And it threw me so off guard because he doesn't speak English. Um, and I said, I love you in return. And it just like I went into the bathroom and just sobbed because I like it took 6+ years for him to hear that in
Mm-hmm.
return from a mother. And I grieved for his biological mother that she
Mm-hmm.
never had the opportunity to share that to him because of her own life circumstances and the
Mm-hmm.
situation that brought her to the place where she felt she had no choice but to give up her son. I mean, like that's heartbreaking. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this element to adoption that, yes, it's beautiful, but we need to let ourselves grieve first
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, it's heartbreaking. And so tapping into that, this is, my grieving as an adoptive mom. But you mentioned that sense of grieving as someone who is adopted and why it was so important for you to do. And I would love to just hear, I think this is something so important for all of us to talk about and hear why it is so essential to grieve adoption.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I've never thought of it that way until you said it.
Mm.
And I, first of all, I think and I think this is a part of the grieving process. I think it's important to say it's okay to not be okay. It's
Yeah.
okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to not understand and work through those emotions. And you can't do that unless you're not talking, unless you're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
Um, but then also do not let it speak to your self worth too. Um, but also feeling the feelings, like you said, of what could have been, of what could have you could have had as a family with your biological parents. It's okay to think about that and wonder about that. But again, the way that I look at it and I frame it, and it's not being dismissive because I truly feel like this, but reiterating the fact that it's not necessarily rejection, but it's protection and it's redirection, and it's better than I could have ever imagined for myself. You know, God always takes something that's so difficult and makes something way better
Mm-hmm.
than you could have ever imagined from it.
Amen. Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think the biggest piece is to say that it's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to feel the feelings that you are feeling and to imagine the things that could have been.
Yeah.
But the most important part is talking about it.
Yeah. And you talk about the idea of rejection. Are you saying, in terms of like when you think about your biological father, like talk about that for a minute and just the emotions that you had to work through as you got older, um, and that concept of rejection, how you deal with that
Mm-hmm.
idea that you were not chosen, like you said so beautifully.
Mm-hmm. So for the longest time when I was younger, it was a defense mechanism of I don't want to meet him. If he doesn't want to meet me, then I don't want to meet him.
Yeah.
And it I didn't realize that again, those were just walls up to protect myself. I didn't really necessarily mean that. And I really don't long to meet him. I don't, I feel like there would be things that I had to work through, like a grieving process of if I did ever encounter him in person, that I would
Yeah.
have to really forgive. I would really have to have some grace for him and understand that anybody in any circumstance, you cannot judge, and you cannot say that you wouldn't do the exact same thing as them,
Right. Right.
and accept that. But as far as rejection goes, I started to realize this theme as I became an adult, especially in my marriage. Everything would always default to, well, I'm just not good enough. I can't do it
Mm,
right. I'm just not good enough.
mm,
And I think it's very much rooted in the fact that from birth, I was not chosen by my biological father. And it's hurtful. And I know he knows about me because as I got older, my parents would say, we would contact him and ask him if we could bring you to him to meet. And he always said no. And come to find out after talking with my biological aunt, he's just a very walled off, reserved, in her words, an angry person.
yeah.
So, um,
I'm probably full of
but
shame. Probably full of
yeah,
shame if
yeah,
he's really being honest. I mean, who wouldn't be? It's human. Yeah.
yeah. And even my mom's full of shame. Every time I would ask her about it,
Mm,
she'd say, "Oh, I knew you were going to ask about this." I was like, "Of
mm.
course I'm going to ask about this. This is my story."
Right.
Um, but yes, feeling rejected in the fact that he did not want me, which could
Yes.
probably, I don't know that, but that's the
Yeah.
story I told myself, or that's
Yeah.
even the lies that the enemy has spun against me and then
Yeah.
used in every facet of my life. Well, you're not good enough. And we knew that from the beginning, which is a lie. It's just a
Yeah.
lie.
Yeah. What would you say? Because I think, not that I would know, but because we're human, I cannot imagine that there is not some point that every adopted child faces this narrative. I mean, I'm putting myself in their shoes. I just can't imagine that there isn't some point in their story, no matter how well they are loved by their adopted parents, that this is not something that they have to face and make a choice how they're going to walk through it because it's human and
Mm-hmm.
it's not how it was meant to be. That's hence the grieving process. Um, so what would you say to the adopted child, regardless of their age at the moment? Um, and where they're at in the journey, what would you say to them as they are facing their own sense of grieving and rejection?
What I would say to them and what I wish I could have said to myself, there's
Yes.
this exercise in that a lot of people talk about where you look at a picture of yourself as a child and you say
Mm,
what you wish someone would have told you. Um, I would just say, as you become older, you will realize, and something that stuck out to me so vividly, like I've said before, is you have no idea what people have gone through and the
mm,
circumstances that have brought them to where they are today. And that has nothing to do with you,
mm,
nothing to do with your worth. They are doing the very, very best that they can. And it says nothing about your worth as a person, or they could have very well have wanted to be a part of your life, but there's something that was missing, that could not happen, and you do not have control over that. You only have control over yourself and your circumstances. But just really making them realize it's not about you whatsoever. They are doing the best that they can.
mm. I think that's beautiful. The concept of almost giving the parent that did not choose you the permission to it's almost like a permission of letting go, I guess. Does that sound right? Like this
Mm-hmm.
permission of grieving it, but then ultimately giving them grace that, like you said, they were in a position where they just felt like something was missing.
Mm-hmm.
Um
And
and
it's not always been like
separating
that.
that. Yes.
It's
Yes.
not, there was anger. There was,
Yes.
especially when I
Yes.
had children of my own.
Yes.
It
Oh,
was,
yes. Oh, I can imagine.
as hard as this can be, because our first was colic. It was very hard. Our first child was colic, and then we had a second. We have no family that lives here in Nashville with us, so
Mm,
we were just doing it all ourselves. And when they say it takes a village, it truly takes a village, and we didn't have
mm,
that. But in the
mm,
midst of all of that and all of that difficulty, I thought, which is kind of makes me feel guilty for thinking this, I could never give one of them up.
mm,
But I
mm,
also have resources. I
mhm.
also was in a good marriage. I also, I was best positioned to be a parent. I think I was very young. We're not
Yeah.
going to deny that. But I also, I thought, looking at my children, I remember holding them and feeding them or rocking them to sleep before bed and thinking, how could I ever release this child to someone else? But then
Mm,
that goes back to, you have no idea what people go through, and you can't
yeah,
say that if you had the exact same life circumstances as someone else, that you wouldn't do exactly what they're doing too.
that's right. And I think the beautiful part about that statement is not only is it showing grace, but it is, like you have said multiple times, it is being really intentional about separating their choices from your self-worth and
Mm-hmm.
your own value. And as you have pointed out so beautifully, I think it does take anger probably first. It does take grieving first. You have to let yourself feel all those emotions before you can even possibly contemplate letting go and separating their story from yours.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as you have gotten older, you had mentioned before that it's really been in the last couple years that you have sort of undergone the difficult work to heal in that way. Tell me a little bit how going through that process has also changed uniquely your relationship with God and how you see yourself in light of because I mean, as an adoptive mom, I have to say, it's just changed. It not only has it changed the concept of grace for me, but has truly changed my understanding of what Jesus has done for me and this idea of being
Mm-hmm.
adopted into his family. And I'll give this
Mm-hmm.
really quick story. When my son was, he was about probably 5 or 6. We had just announced that we were adopting, and it was about a year later, and he was playing in his bedroom. And I walked in, and he just out of the blue, he said, "Mommy, I am so excited to share all of my toys with my brother." And it just was like in this moment, it was just this unbelievable realization of like, that is exactly what Jesus did for me. It's like I did nothing to deserve it. I did nothing to inherit it, but he just so graciously has given me his kingdom as
Mm-hmm.
brother and sister in Christ. And
Mm-hmm.
it was just like that was, Caleb was just so excited to share everything. And like our son, he didn't have to earn it. He didn't have to work really hard to get it. He was just chosen
Mm-hmm.
and everything is freely his. And it was just such an amazing, like, oh, it just has brought scripture alive in a beautiful way. But from your perspective, I would love to hear ways that you have uniquely grown or, um, yeah, understood Jesus and his love for you better.
Mm-hmm. I recently love this affirmation, and the affirmation comes from one of my favorite songs, and it is that all my life you have been so faithful. All my life you've been so so good.
Right.
And looking back after all of these things have transpired, and I've had personal things transpire within my marriage, I've had personal things transpire within my career and going through really tough times. And I was guided through that with spiritual counseling, and I was pushed to really think about and really um, process in my life, and that's how I came to the conclusion that, you know what, actually not knowing my biological father has affected me in my entire life. um, and knowing that I can think of all of the difficult things I've been through in life, and it's just clicked of, oh, that's probably, and we'll never know, right, until we get to heaven and we
Yeah.
get to speak
Yeah.
and say, well, why did this happen? But it's been, like I said, from giving me the earthly father that I have, that I did not deserve, that I did not ask for. um, we almost danced to the dad. Thank you for being the dad that you didn't have to be for me.
Mm.
And showing me an earthly, unconditional, loving relationship that gets so tainted with marriages and love of and separation. But I will always have that. I will always have that relationship with my earthly father, that no matter what, he loves me, and I did nothing to deserve it. Nothing.
Mm.
um, but then also working through a restoration of marriage. I think we talked about this on my
Yeah.
podcast, that you've had a restoration of marriage, and it being beautiful in that way. So really thinking about all the difficult times. And that's hard for people. It's hard for people to think of how I serve such a good God, but these things can happen to me.
Yes.
But there is a real enemy within this world, and there are also your choices that of sin that have repercussions. But coming back to believing that I serve such a good God, that everything that he could have ever wanted for me, despite what I want, is better than I could have ever imagined. And that in staying in prayer, in alignment with his will, that will all come to fruition for me, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the beautiful tension of, I mean, I think this is probably the underlying message of the whole interview, but it's holding in tension grief and gratitude is what I hear. It's like we
Mm,
grieve this is not what it's meant to be, while at the
mm-hmm,
same time holding tightly to, but wow, God is so, so good. And for that,
mm-hmm,
I'm incredibly grateful. And we can't see exactly why everything has unfolded the way that it has until the other side of eternity, if you will. But yeah, he's so, so good. And I think that's a beautiful thing to hold on to. And it takes time to get, as you have
mm,
said, to get to that point.
mm-hmm,
So now my question is, um, what do you say to the adopting mom from your
mm,
perspective, which would be me? We haven't brought our son home yet, but really any adopting mom who is struggling to allow herself to grieve it because it makes her feel nervous that her child won't feel as loved if they
mm,
acknowledge the adoption, if they talk about the hard, things that their child is experiencing, and why, not only why it is so essential for her to walk down that road, but then practical ways for her to step forward, if you will.
Mhm. I first of all, to that mom or to that parent, you are doing the Lord's work. You are embodying exactly who Jesus is and what he did on this earth today. And I have so much respect, so much gratitude for that, just like I do for my father. Um, and and just knowing it's okay to be nervous. It's okay to not want to talk about it, and it's okay to, I guess you could say, pretend that that is your biological child because that's genuinely the way you feel, right?
Mm,
That that child is no different than the child that you birthed yourself. But I, in the same regard, I know that comes from a good place, but I also think that it's really important that we don't not talk about it. Like I know I've said that so many times because I think that that's my story. It was just never, I was never asked how I felt.
yeah.
It was always a, because I never wanted, that's what my dad says. Vanna, you never wanted for anything, but I know deep down I wanted that intimate connection of being able to tell them anything. But if you
Yes.
can't talk about the biggest part of their life, the thing that brought them to you,
Yes.
how are you going to be connected on any other levels? And something that really sticks with me is I see a lot that says, you know, when parents, when your children grow up and they don't need you for finances, they don't need you for shelter, the only thing that's going to hold together your relationship and your intimate relationship with them is the connection that you form emotionally with your child. And it's
Mm-hmm.
so important that their story is a part of that,
Mm,
even if it's not, you know, it's not pretty and it is
mhm.
quote unquote ugly. I don't think that it could ever be ugly. But I don't think that the child will see that until later in life, probably.
Mm, mhm.
Um, but the
It's
practical steps,
uncomfortable.
it's
It's
uncomfortable. It's
very uncomfortable and
beautiful.
it feels unsafe, I think, as a mom is
Hmm.
the concern. It feels very unsafe.
Hmm. And maybe just take baby steps. The practicality of it would be just to take baby steps in, you know, revealing that they have a story that's different. Maybe just tell them that story. Maybe they know their story and then they're the type of child that asks about it. But if they're not the child that asks about it, leave that space open to, would you like to ask anything? Or maybe ask them, do you feel like this affects you in any way? And it may simply not. It may not affect them, and you just holding space for them to speak about it, that may be enough for them.
Mm, mm. I also would throw out there that I'm sure there's some level of approach that is slightly different based on their age and
Mm-hmm.
whether their knowledge of their adoption story. You know, some kids know they've been adopted, and some kids may even look like their adoptive family. Some kids might not even look significantly different, and it almost makes it that much more difficult to talk about the fact that they're adopted because they look
Mm-hmm.
so much like their family. Um, so there's all ends of the spectrum, but, you know, what I'm here as a, you know, adoptive mom about to bring her son home, what I'm hearing is that there needs to be ongoing, open, safe space for these conversations to be happening, and I think it's valuable for the whole family to be having them. You know, I think about my biological kids and wanting them to also be empowered to speak openly about the fact that he's adopted. It's a fact, but it's not his value, right? It doesn't define
Mm-hmm.
him.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he's Polynesian and he's brown skinned, and right, it's like these are biological facts, not his
Mm-hmm.
value, not who he is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and trying to help create that open space. And then I'm reiterating here what Vanna is saying as I'm hearing it. Um, Creating ongoing conversation where we as parents are asking the questions. And uh what she didn't say and I'll say is this is our responsibility as parents. It doesn't matter if our kid does not show interest. It is our responsibility to bring up the uncomfortable questions.
Mhm.
and create that space. So simple ways to ask might be, as Vanna had kind of phrased it, do you ever struggle with feeling different, or that somehow, um, how does it make you feel that you are adopted? I mean, I'm
Mhm.
literally throwing out it just to open that space is what I'm hearing. Would you add anything to that, Vanna?
I think that's a beautiful place to start. And then I also think within prayer and
Mm,
saying, Lord, I am a vessel. You know exactly what this child needs. You
mm,
know
amen.
yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Prompt me in what I should be asking them. But I think the first step is to just is again create an environment and a space that allows them to feel comfortable to even talk about that. And we're starting that with our children, and it's hard. They reject it. I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I think it's important to say that age is definitely going to play a role. But when they get really upset in their feelings, they shut down. They don't want to talk about it. They want to be
Yeah.
in their cozy space because we've created that for them. And I will just say, I know you, buddy, I know you don't want to talk about this right now, and I'm going to respect that. But I'm also going to tell you when you get older, the more you shut down, the more you bottle up, one day it's going to come to the surface, and you can't isolate everyone. So just
Mm.
again, holding that space, asking God in his leading on that, but also just reiterating of this is why I'm coming to you, and this is why I'll always continue to come to you. I will never give up on you in this way.
I love it. It's beautiful, and also a beautiful reminder to cap it all with the reality that we're not going to get it perfect. And this is
Uh-uh.
precisely why, praise the Lord, we're not doing it alone. And so it was a beautiful reminder that I think first and foremost, we pray for wisdom. We pray for wisdom, the questions to ask, when to push, right? When to pause, when to just pray, when to praise, just asking the Lord for guidance over all of those things, and finding support and people like Vanna who are willing to share their story. We are not meant to do life alone, which is why I'm so grateful, Vanna, that you have come and shared. You have such a beautiful story, and I'm so grateful for you in the way that God is going to use your willingness to share. And I think of your biological dad, and in many ways he's given us a gift, and I hope if ever he hears this one day, that any shame he feels would just be stripped away, because you are such a light. And in many ways, you share things that you would have otherwise not known if he had chosen you, frankly. And so I'm just so grateful for the gift uh, that you are. It's been an
Thank you.
honor.
Thank you for allowing me to tell my story, but not only making this a safe, comfortable space for me because this is, I think, the first time I've ever publicly talked about adoption. I've publicly talked
Mm,
about being half adopted, not knowing my biological father, but as far as the story goes, the background behind it, and the emotional aspect that I've had to work through. I
mm.
think this is the first and only time. Usually I'm on podcasts talking about skincare and
Yeah.
dermatology. So it's been very different for me. Thank you for being patient and again creating a safe space for me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching the Imperfectly Empowered podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the channel by clicking below. And if you missed our last video, then be sure to check it out right here. We'll see you next time on the podcast. Your story matters, and you are loved.